Imagine walking almost 500 kilometers on bare, bleeding feet, with no food, no money, and no one waiting for you at the end of the road. Now imagine that same barefoot, starving boy growing up to build one of the most valuable brands the world has ever known. This is not a fairy tale. This really happened, and today you are going to hear the whole thing, from the coldest, hungriest nights of his childhood to the golden monogram that now sits on handbags worth more than most people's houses. Stay with me until the end, because the lessons hidden inside this story are just as powerful as the empire it created. This is the true story of Louis Vuitton, a boy who owned nothing, yet somehow built everything. We tell stories like this one because history is filled with people who had every excuse to quit and chose not to. Most of us will never walk 500 kilometers with an empty stomach. But every single one of us knows what it feels like to face a moment where giving up seems like the only reasonable option. That's exactly why this story matters. It isn't really about handbags or trunks or luxury brands at all. It's about a young boy who refused to let his circumstances decide his future and who kept walking, kept learning, and kept building, long after most people would have stopped. Before we begin, let me tell you why this story matters, not only for the lesson it teaches, but for your English as well. As you listen, you will hear natural storytelling, useful vocabulary, and real expressions people actually use. So relax, listen closely, and let the story carry you forward while your English quietly grows stronger in the background. Now, let's travel back to the year 1821. In a small, quiet town called Angers, tucked into the hills of eastern France, a baby boy came into the world. His parents named him Louis. There were no celebrations, no gifts, no comfort waiting for him. His family was poor, and poverty in that region was not gentle. His father spent his days shaping wood into furniture, working with tired hands from morning until dark. His mother made hats, stitching quietly by candlelight to earn a few extra coins. Together, they barely scraped enough together to keep their small household fed. The house Louis grew up in had thin walls and a roof that let the winter wind whistle straight through. When snow buried the town for months at a time, there was no warm fire waiting, no thick blankets, no comfort at all. Louis learned very early that the world was not soft or forgiving. While other children played in the streets, he was already working, dragging heavy timber, learning to use tools far too big for his small hands, breathing in sawdust instead of laughter. Yet even in that hard, cold life, something inside Louis refused to stay small. Every so often, wealthy travelers passed through Angers on their way to somewhere grander. They carried heavy trunks and polished cases, wore clean coats, and spoke of cities Louis had never seen. He would stop whatever he was doing and simply watch them go. Where were they headed? What kind of life allowed a person to own so many fine things? He didn't know the answers, but a quiet hunger began growing inside him. A hunger to see more of the world than the four walls of his village. Life in Angers followed a strict rhythm that never seemed to change. Louis woke before dawn to help his father sort planks of wood, then spent his afternoons running small errands for neighbors, just to earn a crust of bread or a bowl of soup. He rarely complained, mostly because complaining changed nothing, and because there was rarely anyone around with the time or energy to listen anyway. Poverty was simply the air he breathed. Still, at night, lying on his thin straw mattress, he sometimes allowed himself to imagine another kind of life entirely, one filled with warm rooms, full plates, and cities he had only heard mentioned in passing conversations between traveling merchants. Those quiet imaginings were the only luxury a boy like him could ever afford, and he treasured them fiercely, even as the cold crept through the cracks in the walls around him. Then, when Louis was only 10 years old, tragedy arrived. His mother grew seriously ill. There was no doctor nearby who could help her, no medicine strong enough to fight whatever was taking her strength away. Little by little, she faded, until one quiet morning, she was simply gone. Louis stood beside her grave that day, too shocked even to cry. His father, crushed under his own grief, pulled away from everything, including his son. For the first time in his short life, Louis felt truly and completely alone. But grief did something unexpected inside him. Instead of breaking him, it lit a fire. Louis made a silent promise to himself, standing at that graveside. He would not spend his whole life buried in this small, forgotten town. He would leave. He would find something bigger, even if he had absolutely no idea what that something was yet. By the time he turned 13, the plan was set, even though it barely deserved to be called a plan. Paris sat nearly 470 kilometers away. Louis had no money for a coach, no horse to ride, not even proper shoes for walking. Most people would have called the idea impossible. Louis called it his only choice. One night, while the rest of the house slept, Louis quietly gathered a few belongings into a small sack. He didn't wake his father. He didn't leave a note. He simply opened the door, stepped out into the darkness, and began walking toward a city he had never seen. What followed were 2 brutal years on the road. Picture it clearly: a teenage boy, walking alone through forests, over hills, across freezing rivers, with blistered feet and an empty stomach more often than not. Sometimes a stranger offered him bread or a place to sleep in a barn. Other nights, he simply lay down under the open sky and hoped the cold wouldn't be too unbearable. He picked up small jobs on farms along the way, trading sweat and labor for a meal or a few coins. Storms soaked him. Winter bit at his skin. And still, somehow, he kept walking. There were nights when Louis genuinely believed he wouldn't survive until morning. Once, deep in a forest, a sudden storm trapped him beneath a half-collapsed shelter of branches for nearly 2 days, with nothing to eat but a handful of wild berries he found nearby. Another time, a farmer nearly turned him away with a raised stick, mistaking the ragged, exhausted boy for a common thief. Yet somehow, each time disaster threatened to end his journey completely, something, luck, stubbornness, or sheer refusal to quit, pulled him back onto his feet again. He measured his progress not in kilometers, but in small, private victories. A warm meal earned through honest labor, a dry barn to sleep in, a stranger's brief kindness that reminded him the world wasn't entirely cruel. Finally, after those 2 grueling years, 13-year-old Louis, now 15, arrived at the edge of Paris. The city he had imagined for so long turned out to be nothing like his dreams. Yes, there was the smell of fresh bread, the noise of busy markets, and streets overflowing with people, but there was also filth, crime, and desperate poverty crammed into every corner. Paris did not open its arms to a penniless boy from the countryside. It barely noticed him at all. That first night in the city, Louis had nowhere to sleep. He found an old, abandoned cart tucked behind a bakery and crawled inside it, using his small sack as a pillow. The streets never went quiet. Carts rattled, people shouted, rats scurried in the shadows. But exhaustion eventually pulled him into sleep anyway. The next morning, hunger woke him before the sun fully rose. He wandered past bakery windows, watching well-dressed customers buy warm bread he could only smell. never taste. He needed work immediately, so he began knocking on doors, asking shopkeepers for any job at all. Again and again, the answer was the same. No experience, no connections, no room for a stranger. Days passed. Louis grew thinner, weaker, more desperate. He picked up scraps from the ground when no one was watching, too proud to beg but too hungry to refuse free food entirely. Still, something in him refused to turn back toward Anche. Stay with me here, because this part of the story is exactly where most people would have given up. Louis had already survived 2 years of walking, only to arrive in a city that treated him like he was invisible. He could have accepted defeat quietly, found the nearest road home, and spent the rest of his life wondering what might have happened if he had simply pushed a little further. Instead, every single rejection seemed to sharpen his determination rather than dull it. He began waking earlier, walking farther across the city, knocking on doors long after most people would have stopped trying for the day. One evening, everything shifted. Louis noticed a man struggling badly to carry an enormous wooden trunk toward a shop entrance, sweat pouring down his face. Without a second thought, Louis rushed over and grabbed the other end. Together, the two of them wrestled the heavy trunk safely inside. Stepping through that doorway, Louis found himself inside a workshop unlike anything he had ever seen. Walls lined with trunks of every shape, some wrapped in leather, others fitted with gleaming brass corners and hand-painted initials. This was the workshop of a respected trunk maker named Monsieur Maréchal, and Maréchal had just watched this thin, ragged boy lift a trunk that had defeated a grown man. "You're stronger than you look," Maréchal said, studying him carefully. "What do they call you?" "Louis Vuitton, sir," the boy answered, standing as straight as his tired body allowed. "I'm looking for work, any work." "Do you know how to build a trunk?" Maréchal asked. Louis didn't hesitate. "No, sir, but I can learn faster than anyone you've ever hired." Maréchal studied him a moment longer, then shrugged. "Everyone says that. Show up tomorrow before sunrise. No pay at first. You'll earn that once you're worth something." It wasn't a fortune. It wasn't even a promise. But it was a door, and Louis walked through it without hesitation. For the first stretch of time, his job was hardly glamorous. Sweeping floors, hauling supplies, cleaning up scraps of leather and wood shavings. But Louis paid attention to everything. Every hammer strike, every stitch, every cut of wood. He studied silently, memorizing the process piece by piece. After the workshop emptied each evening, he stayed behind alone, practicing on scrap materials, teaching his own hands the skills his eyes had absorbed all day. One morning, Maréchal discovered a small wooden panel Louis had shaped the night before. The joints were tight, the lines were clean, the craftsmanship far beyond what a beginner should manage. "Did you make this yourself?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. Louis nodded, bracing for criticism. Instead, Maréchal set the panel down carefully. "Stay after hours from now on. I'll teach you properly." That single decision changed everything. Night after night, Louis absorbed real training: how to choose the finest wood, how to select and prepare leather, how to stitch seams so tightly they would hold for decades. He learned to judge the quality of a plank of wood simply by tapping it and listening to the sound it made. He learned which types of leather would age gracefully and which would crack within a single season. He learned patience too, the kind of patience that comes only from ruining a dozen pieces before finally producing one worth keeping. Other apprentices came and went, frustrated by the slow, repetitive nature of the work, but Louis never once complained. He had walked 470 kilometers for this opportunity, and he intended to make every single hour of it count. Years slipped by, and the frightened boy who once begged for scraps became one of the most skilled trunk makers in the entire workshop. Wealthy clients began requesting him specifically, saying his work was simply the finest available in Paris. Then, one afternoon, everything changed again. A striking woman entered the shop, dressed in silk, jewelry catching the light with every movement. This was no ordinary customer. This was Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, ruler of France. Her sharp eyes moved across the room until they landed on Louis. "Are you the craftsman they speak of? The one called Vuitton?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Louis answered, bowing slightly, his pulse racing. "I need something different," she said. "My trunks are heavy and clumsy, impossible to stack properly for travel. I want something new, something no one else has thought to create." Every existing trunk on the market shared the same flaw: rounded tops, built that way so rain would slide off during transport by carriage. But rounded tops also meant trunks could never be stacked, wasting precious space and making travel unnecessarily difficult. Louis had noticed this flaw for years, quietly turning the problem over in his mind while sweeping floors and hauling supplies as a young apprentice. Now, standing before the most powerful woman in France, he finally had both the skill and the reason to fix it. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "what if I built you a trunk with a completely flat top, light enough to carry easily, and covered in a waterproof canvas instead of heavy leather? It could be stacked, transported easily, and still remain elegant." Marechal shot him a look of disbelief. No one changed a trunk's basic design, not for anyone. But the Empress tilted her head, clearly intrigued. "Flat-topped and stackable. Prove it to me, Vuitton." For the following weeks, Louis barely slept. He selected poplar wood for its light yet sturdy frame. He flattened the top entirely, a radical shift from centuries of tradition. And for the surface, he chose a smooth, water-resistant gray canvas instead of the usual thick leather, durable, lightweight, and completely unlike anything travelers had seen before. Every night during those weeks, Louis returned to the same worry. What if his idea failed completely? What if the Empress found the design strange rather than brilliant, and his boldness cost him the reputation he had spent years building? But fear, he had learned long ago, was simply something to work alongside, not something that could be allowed to stop him. He tested the canvas repeatedly, sometimes late into the night, pouring water over samples again and again to check exactly how well it resisted moisture. He adjusted the frame again and again until the weight felt exactly right, light enough to lift with one hand, sturdy enough to survive rough travel over uneven roads. Every detail mattered, because he understood that this single trunk could either open every door in Paris or close them permanently. When the finished trunk was finally presented at the palace, the room fell silent. The Empress ran her fingers slowly across the smooth canvas, examined the brass fittings, tested the precise stitching. Finally, she looked up. "Vuitton," she said, "this is remarkable. From now on, you will craft my trunks personally." Word spread through Paris almost overnight. If it was good enough for the Empress, wealthy families across the city suddenly wanted the very same thing. But Louis was still working under someone else's name, someone else's shop. He wanted his own. With roughly $1,000 in savings by today's value, Louis rented a modest space and opened his own business, hanging a simple wooden sign outside that read, "Louis Vuitton, Trunk Maker." He had arrived in Paris as a penniless orphan. Now, he was finally his own master. The early years of independence were exhausting. Louis had no employees, no factory, no safety net. Every single trunk was built entirely by his own two hands. from sunrise deep into the night. Then war arrived, and everything nearly collapsed. Conflict tore through France. Wealthy clients fled the capital, and demand for luxury goods disappeared almost entirely. Louis's small shop, once thriving, sat nearly silent for months. There were weeks when Louis considered closing the shop entirely and searching for any other way to feed himself. He remembered the hunger of his childhood vividly, and the thought of returning to that kind of desperation terrified him more than any amount of hard labor ever could. Yet giving up meant admitting defeat, and defeat was something he had refused to accept since the night he quietly slipped out of his father's house all those years earlier. So he kept working, one trunk at a time, even when there was almost no one left in the city willing to buy them. He sold tools just to survive, cut every possible cost, and still teetered on the edge of losing it all. But when the fighting finally ended, something shifted. People wanted to travel again, to feel elegance and stability return to their lives. And they remembered the name Vuitton. Orders poured back in, faster than ever before. In 1871, Louis opened a much larger workshop just outside Paris, 4 times the size of his original shop, hiring workers and training apprentices to keep pace with demand. Around this same period, Louis married a woman named Clémence, who believed deeply in his vision and stood firmly by his side through every challenge. They welcomed a son, Georges, who would eventually inherit and expand everything his father had built. Yet success demanded sacrifice. Countless nights, countless missed family moments, all spent perfecting his craft inside a quiet workshop. Louis understood something many business owners never grasp. True luxury isn't built by selling to everyone. It's built by selling to the few who set every trend that follows. Wealthy, influential clients don't argue over price. They crave exclusivity above all else. So Louis focused entirely on a small circle of elite customers, willing to pay generously for handcrafted perfection. Naturally, as the elite embraced his trunks, everyone beneath them began to dream of owning one too. It was a simple, almost invisible strategy, yet it proved far more powerful than any advertisement could have been. Wealth, Louis understood, has always carried a certain gravity. The rest of society tends to orbit around whatever the rich desire, whatever they wear, whatever they carry through the streets of a fashionable city. By anchoring his brand firmly at the very top of that hierarchy, he ensured that demand would eventually trickle downward on its own, without him ever needing to chase it. In 1892, Louis Vuitton passed away, leaving his son Georges to carry the family name forward. Before he died, he offered Georges one final piece of wisdom: never chase cheap sales, never abandon quality, and never let the world change who you truly are, even while everything around you shifts constantly. Georges took that advice seriously. He expanded far beyond trunks, introducing handbags, cutlery cases, and custom traveling accessories that reshaped the world of luxury fashion entirely. But success brought imitators. Cheap counterfeit versions began flooding markets everywhere, tricking unsuspecting buyers into purchasing fakes. To fight back, Georges introduced the now famous interlocking monogram pattern in 1896, a design deliberately created to be nearly impossible to copy convincingly. Georges also understood something his father had only begun to explore. A brand needed more than beautiful craftsmanship. It needed a story people wanted to belong to. He traveled internationally to showcase the company's work at world exhibitions, placed advertisements in fashionable magazines read by the elite, and personally ensured that every single piece leaving the workshop met an impossibly high standard. Customers didn't just buy a Vuitton trunk anymore. They bought a piece of a growing legend. Under Georges' leadership, the brand didn't merely survive, it dominated. Stores opened internationally, handbags became global symbols of status, and the House of Vuitton grew into something far larger than one workshop in Paris could have ever imagined. But by the 1930s, age and years of relentless work finally caught up with Georges, and in 1936, he passed away. His son, Gaston Louis Vuitton, stepped forward next, inheriting a company facing enormous challenges. The Great Depression had crushed businesses across the entire world, and automobiles and airplanes were quickly replacing traditional steamer trunks as the preferred way to travel. Gaston Louis understood immediately that standing still meant certain death for the brand. So he pushed forward boldly, expanding into small leather goods, everyday handbags, and fashion-forward accessories designed for modern life rather than old-fashioned voyages. It was a risky bet at the time, since much of the brand's reputation still rested on its trunks. But Gaston Louis understood that clinging too tightly to the past was often the fastest way to disappear from the future entirely. Just as momentum began building again, World War II erupted, and France fell under German occupation. Businesses everywhere collapsed under the strain, and Gaston Louis faced an impossible decision: shut everything down completely, or find some way to keep operations running through the chaos. He chose survival, continuing operations under extraordinarily difficult wartime conditions, a controversial chapter that remained largely hidden from public knowledge for many decades afterward. Once the war finally ended, Europe lay in economic ruin, and luxury goods were the last thing on most people's minds. Yet Gaston Louis held on to one simple truth: even during hardship, the wealthiest people in society always find a way to remain wealthy, and they never fully abandon their appetite for exclusivity. By focusing relentlessly on premium, high-quality products, the brand slowly rebuilt its reputation throughout the 1950s, introducing now legendary designs like the Speedy handbag, the versatile Keep-All travel bag, and the elegant Noé, originally created to transport champagne bottles safely. Each of these designs shared a common philosophy passed down directly from Louis himself: build something so well made that it outlasts every passing trend, and let quality speak louder than advertising ever could. Customers who purchased these pieces in the 1950s often passed them down to their children decades later, a small but powerful proof that the brand's founding obsession with durability had never truly faded. By the 1960s, Louis Vuitton stood among the most respected luxury names on earth. Yet it still operated much like a traditional family business, in a world quickly becoming far more competitive and global. Gaston Louis brought in his son-in-law, Henri Racamier, to help modernize operations and prepare the company for an entirely new era of growth. Racamier wasn't a designer or a craftsman by trade. He was a visionary businessman who immediately recognized something extraordinary hiding inside this respected but still relatively small operation: enormous untapped potential. At the time, Louis Vuitton sold mainly to a limited circle of elite customers scattered across Europe. Racamier believed it could become something far bigger, a true global powerhouse. So he made several bold, calculated moves. First, he pushed aggressively into new markets, particularly the United States, Japan, and the Middle East, regions overflowing with wealthy customers hungry for genuine luxury. Second, he deliberately raised prices, understanding a simple psychological truth: scarcity and cost only deepen desire among status-conscious buyers. Lowering prices might have boosted short-term sales, but it would have quietly destroyed the very exclusivity that made the brand desirable in the first place. and Racamier refused to make that trade. Third, he transformed ordinary retail stores into genuine luxury experiences, complete with private shopping suites and exceptional personalized service that made every customer feel extraordinary. The brand deliberately avoided chasing mass-market appeal, instead targeting only the wealthiest tier of global society: celebrities, royalty, and billionaires. Limited edition collections, rare exotic leathers, and fully customized commissions became central to the brand's identity. Some crocodile skin handbags alone commanded prices between $50,000 and well over $100,000. Custom-built travel trunks, tailored precisely to a client's exact specifications, could reach values approaching $500,000. Some of these commissions were built specifically for private jets or yachts, complete with fitted compartments for wine bottles, jewelry, or entire wardrobes, each one taking skilled artisans hundreds of hours to complete by hand. The message behind every single one of these pieces remained exactly the same as it had been over a century earlier. This is not something you can simply buy off a shelf. This is something built specifically and only for you. Naturally, such extreme desirability attracted counterfeiters everywhere. Throughout the 1980s, fake Vuitton products flooded street markets across major cities worldwide, threatening to damage the brand's carefully protected exclusivity. In response, Racamier launched one of the most aggressive anti-counterfeiting campaigns the fashion industry had ever witnessed, hiring dedicated investigators, pushing governments toward stricter enforcement, and embedding advanced security features directly into every genuine product. This wasn't simply about protecting profit margins, though that certainly mattered too. It was about protecting the very idea the brand was built on: a luxury product that anyone could easily replicate for a fraction of the price stops being luxury at all, no matter how beautifully it was originally designed. Exclusivity had to be defended just as fiercely as it had been built in the first place. Then, in 1987, Racamier orchestrated a truly historic move, merging Louis Vuitton with the champagne producer Moet et Chandon and cognac maker Hennessy, forming an entirely new luxury conglomerate known as LVMH. This merger instantly transformed Louis Vuitton from a respected fashion house into a cornerstone of the largest luxury empire ever assembled, spanning fashion, jewelry, cosmetics, and fine spirits. On paper, it looked like three unrelated companies simply combining their names. In practice, it created something entirely new: a machine capable of sharing resources, marketing power, and global retail networks across dozens of brands at once, giving Louis Vuitton access to opportunities that would have been unthinkable for a single-family workshop just a few decades earlier. However, Racamier wouldn't control this new empire for long. A determined young businessman named Bernard Arnault recognized LVMH's enormous untapped value and moved swiftly to seize control. Through a series of aggressive corporate maneuvers throughout 1989, Arnault successfully pushed Racamier out entirely, positioning himself as the most influential figure in global luxury fashion, a position he has never really relinquished since. Once firmly in control, Arnault expanded LVMH dramatically, pushing further into emerging markets across China, Russia, and India, while acquiring iconic fashion houses including Dior, Givenchy, and Fendi along the way. Under his relentless leadership, LVMH eventually surpassed $500 billion in total value, becoming the wealthiest luxury conglomerate the world has ever seen, with Arnault himself frequently ranked among the richest individuals on the planet. What began as a single struggling trunk-making workshop had, over the course of a single century and a half, transformed into a sprawling global empire, touching nearly every corner of the luxury industry. Proof that the foundations laid by one determined, penniless teenager could support far more weight than anyone around him ever imagined possible. Today, owning a genuine Louis Vuitton piece still represents something far beyond simple fashion. It signals achievement, exclusivity, and undeniable craftsmanship. Every single product remains handmade by skilled artisans trained in techniques passed down across generations. More than a century and a half after that barefoot, orphaned boy first arrived in Paris with absolutely nothing, his name continues to represent the very peak of global luxury. Millions of people around the world recognize the interlocking pattern he inspired, even if only a small fraction of them ever fully learn the story behind it. The story of hunger, loss, and one impossibly long walk that started it all. And that, right there, is the true power of this story. Louis Vuitton wasn't born wealthy, wasn't born connected, and wasn't handed a single advantage in life. He was handed hardship, grief, and hunger instead. Yet he transformed every ounce of that suffering into relentless determination, turning a 500-kilometer walk of desperation into the foundation of a billion-dollar legacy. Whatever difficulty you're facing right now, remember this. Sometimes the most painful chapters of your story become the very foundation of everything you eventually build. Louis never had a mentor to guide him through those early years. No financial safety net if his plans collapsed. No guarantee that any of it would work out in his favor. He simply refused to stop moving forward, one difficult step at a time, trusting that persistence would eventually open a door that talent and hope alone could never force open. That single trait, more than any trunk, any handbag, or any monogram, is the real inheritance he left behind. If this story moved you, and if you want more powerful true stories exactly like this one, join our community here at Wisdom Loom English. We share incredible, true, and inspiring journeys just like this every single week, all designed to help you learn English naturally while your mind stays completely engaged. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next incredible story we bring you.